Welcome to your deep dive. Today, we're diving deep into a conversation that's really got people talking, trans experiences.
hmm
And you know what? You've sent us some seriously fascinating stuff, a transcript from this podcast debate. You've got a trans woman and a self-described red pill advocate going head to head.
Wow, yeah.
And let me tell you, it is full-on disagreement, personal stories, even some statistics that'll raise your eyebrows.
Yeah.
So if you're ready, we're going to break it all down, the arguments, the science behind transitioning, you name it.
Sounds good.
Hopefully by the end of this deep dive, you'll walk away not just informed, but like with a whole new way of looking at this whole thing, because
Yeah.
it's seriously multifaceted.
Absolutely.
All right, before we get into the thick of it, let's set the scene, shall we? We're dealing with two totally different viewpoints here.
Totally, yeah. And it's important to remember that on one side, we've got Skylar, a trans woman who's been there, done that with gender affirmation surgery and hormone therapy.
Right.
And on the other side, there's this guy who identifies with the whole red pill philosophy.
And that can be a whole other can of worms, right?
Yeah, it can be. Often means they're super traditional about gender roles, skeptical of anything that challenges those norms.
Like they see the world in black and white, no shades of gray.
Exactly.
And you can feel that tension from the get-go, right? Like they clash right away on the most basic question, what makes a man? A man, a woman, a woman.
Like their whole worlds are built on different foundations. Skylar's coming from this place of gender identity is inherent, It's
Yeah.
like it's in your brain, not just about what you're born with.
Well, the red pill guy is like, biology is everything, right?
Yeah, pretty much. He's all about biological effects is the only thing that matters.
End of story. And you know what really gets to me? Skylar, she makes it so personal.
Right.
Sharing her whole journey of transitioning later in life, talking about this intense dysphoria she felt, especially during puberty, like her own body was betraying her,
Yeah, and that's a really important point to pause on, that dysphoria.
Absolutely.
It's like imagine feeling so much distress because who you feel inside doesn't match up with your body.
It's like being trapped in your own skin.
And for some people, it's completely debilitating.
Which brings us to the whole medical and scientific aspect of transitioning, right? And this is where the debate gets really fiery.
Oh, yeah.
Skylar, she's arguing that hormone therapy and surgery, they're proven ways to help with that dysphoria, even brings in some studies to back it up.
Right.
But then, oh boy, the red pill advocate, he comes out swinging with some wild claims.
Yeah, and we got to address these because, whoa, he goes there.
Like what?
He starts talking about big pharma cashing in on trans healthcare, even calls hormone therapy chemical castration. And then he goes even further, hinting at like a population control conspiracy.
Oh yeah, hold on. Is he serious? That sounds more like a conspiracy theory than actual science.
It's important to be able to tell the difference, right? Because throwing around stuff like that is dangerous. It spreads misinformation. Like hormone therapy is about helping people's bodies match their identities. It's about reducing suffering, not causing it.
Right. So no secret agendas or forced sterilization plots?
No, not at all. We got to stick to credible medical sources, not fear-mongering. This is about people's lives,
Absolutely. And that leads us to the whole battle of the statistics, right?
Yeah.
Each side starts throwing out numbers like they're going out of style.
Oh, yeah.
The red pill guy, he's all about these studies claiming sky-high suicide rates for trans people after they transition, trying to paint this really bleak picture, But then Skylar, she counters with research showing positive outcomes for people who transition, especially when they've got support.
Right.
So, how are we supposed to make sense of all these numbers flying around? It's like they cancel each other out.
That's where critical thinking comes in. Anyone can throw numbers at you. You got to look deeper.
Right.
Who did this study? What methods did they use? Were the participants representative? And here's the big one. What didn't they tell you that might change how you see the whole thing?
They say there are lies, damned lies, and statistics.
That's
So we
right.
got to be careful about just taking things at face value, right?
Right. Like some studies might show higher rates of mental health struggles among trans people,
Right.
but they don't always consider the pressure, the discrimination, the lack of support so many face every single day.
So it's like, is it the transitioning that's the problem, or is it how society treats them?
Exactly. That's the nuance that gets lost sometimes.
It's a good reminder that things aren't always as simple as they seem.
Never are they?
Nope. And with something as sensitive as this, approaching it with a little nuance and empathy, that goes a long way.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah, no, for sure. We can't just get lost in the numbers and forget about the actual people,
Right, exactly.
And speaking of people, This debate, it's like, it takes a sharp turn from the sciencey stuff. It's like they moved from the lab to the steps of the courthouse, you know? They get into the whole bathroom argument, this idea of trans women in women's spaces, and then bam, there's this whole thing about a trans agenda.
It's like they turned up the heat and forgot the lights.
Right. It's like all shadows and no real substance.
Yeah, and that's the thing. You got to be so careful with those kinds of phrases. You know, trans agenda. It's like people use it to scare folks rather than actually explain anything.
It's like a dog whistle, right?
Exactly. Often what they're really talking about is, trans people just wanting to be seen and heard.
Like basic human stuff.
Totally. Having their pronouns respected, being able to access health care, just living their lives authentically,
Without being afraid all the time.
Exactly. But instead, it gets spun into this whole agenda thing.
Yeah, it's wild. And then there's that whole bathroom argument. Like, he's really worried about trans women in women's spaces.
Let's be real. There's no evidence to back that up. Studies have looked into it, and there's no increased risk.
It's like this fear tactic,
Right. Playing on people's fears instead of looking at the facts.
It's amazing how fast that kind of stuff can spread, though.
Misinformation. Oh, it's like wildfire online.
No kidding. But, okay, so we've got these arguments flying around, but what about Skylar? Like, how's she dealing with all of this?
Well, and I think this is so important to remember. She's speaking from her own experiences,
Right.
She talks about how just being open about being trans, it brought on so much like transphobia, discrimination, people treating her differently, rejecting her.
Even in dating, right.
Especially in dating, yeah.
Which just shows you how deeply ingrained some of this stuff is.
Right. It's not just some abstract debate. It's her life,
Yeah.
And unfortunately, it's the reality for a lot of trans people, especially trans women of color.
It's heartbreaking, really. But it's like, even with all of that, he still brings up this whole thing about disclosure.
Oh, yeah, the ethics of it all.
Yeah, like trans people have this moral obligation to out themselves before any kind of romantic relationship.
Before things even go there, he's saying.
Right, and then he compares it to not disclosing an STI.
Which is, come on, that's just a low blow.
Fiercely.
Like reducing someone's entire identity to a medical condition they have to disclose, It just perpetuates the stigma.
It's dehumanizing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Makes it seem like being trans is something to be ashamed of.
Like you gotta whisper it in the dark.
Exactly. And Skylar, she's not having it.
Good for her.
She's like, hold up, this is my life, my privacy. Why do I have to constantly justify my existence?
It's like he's putting all the responsibility on her.
Right. And it brings up this really complex question about privacy versus, like, someone else's right to know, especially in intimate situations.
It's messy, right? Like, where do you draw the line? It's like you're constantly walking on eggshells, right?
Yeah.
Like trying to balance honesty and protecting yourself in a world that can be so judgmental.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And, it really hit me listening to them both, how different their language is. Skylar's talking about her life, her feelings, like really trying to connect with people on a human level.
Nice.
And the red pill guy, it's all biology and fear, like appealing to these traditional ideas, playing on anxieties.
It's like they're speaking two different languages using the same words.
Exactly. And that's the hardest part, isn't it?
Yeah.
Bridging that gap.
Totally. So, okay, let's bring it back to, everyone listening. Even if you don't know anyone who's trans, why should you even care about this whole debate? What's the takeaway?
I think this goes way beyond just trans rights. It's about, like, who are we? What kind of world are we building?
Goes deep.
Right? Like, do we cling to these rigid categories, these old ways of thinking? Or do we make space for people to just be?
To be their authentic selves.
Exactly, to live their truths. And that takes, actually listening to each other, questioning our own biases.
And being willing to have tough conversations, even when it's uncomfortable.
Especially then, right? This deep dive, it's been a lot. The science, those statistics, the sheer impact of transphobia.
Funny stuff.
But you know what sticks with me? The stories. Skylar's story. The stories of so many trans people just trying to navigate a world that doesn't always get them.
And we can't just sit back and watch it happen, right? We have to educate ourselves, challenge our own assumptions.
Be better, do better, right?
Yeah.
Advocate for a world that's more just, more equitable.
Absolutely. And maybe, just maybe, these kinds of conversations, as tough as they can be, can help us understand each other a little better.
Build some bridges instead of walls,
Love that. Okay, here's a final thought for you all to chew on. In our everyday lives, all these labels, man, woman, trans, how much do they really matter? When do they help us understand each other, and when do they just get in the way? Something to think about, right? The human experience, it's messy and complex, and that's okay.
It makes life interesting, right?
Exactly. This has been your deep dive. Go out there, keep asking those tough questions, and keep the conversation going.